The 3,000th year of my vigil began not with a chime or a liturgical summons, but with the sudden, agonizing cessation of the great vox, hymnal that permeates the salt-caked corridors of the Tenebrae vault. Silence in the Inquisition's deepest archives is a physical blow, a vacuum that pulls the air from your lungs and replaces it with the copper tang of impending termination. We are the scribes of the redacted, the keepers of the protocol of unspoken absence, a mandate so absolute that, to even acknowledge its activation, is to forfeit one's right to a name. The pressure in my skull intensified as the emergency containment seals hissed shut, locking me within a chamber of weeping stone and ticking cogitators. Across the sector, stars were being snuffed out in a sequence that defied logic, and I realized with a trembling hand that the final ledger was now open. If you still walk beside me through fire and scripture, then bear witness. Subscribe, share this burden, and let others hear the truth buried beneath hymns. The stillness following the alarm's death was a poison, a silent toxin that seeped into the marrow of my bones as I stood amidst the wreckage of a lifetime's devotion to the archives of the Ordo Scriptum. I am a creature of the ink and the hum, a man whose skin has turned to the color of the vellum I protect. Yet in that moment, the weight of the protocol of unspoken absence rendered me lighter than the ash falling from the overhead vents. To understand the terror that keeps the masters of the Inquisition awake, one must first understand the nature of a secret that cannot be recorded. Even in the deepest vaults of the Segmentum Solar, my boots crunched on the salt crust of the floor, a sound like breaking glass in a tomb. As I moved toward the primary cogitator bank to confirm what my soul already knew, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and the wet, metallic tang of recycled oxygen that had passed through 1,000 pairs of lungs before reaching this sub-level. Every breath felt like a trespass against the silence. This protocol was not designed for a simple invasion, nor for the rising tide of a heretical cult, or even the soul-shredding emergence of a warp rift. Those are terrors of the flesh and the spirit that the Imperium understands how to bleed for. This was the contingency for the erasure of causality, a directive that exists solely for the moment when the throne's own shadow begins to consume the light it was meant to cast. I reached the terminal, my fingers hovering over keys smoothed by centuries of use, and I saw the red, shifted data streams cascading across the screen like arterial blood. The numbers did not calculate a loss of life, but a loss of existence. Entire systems were not being conquered, they were being forgotten. Their entries in the stellar maps dissolving into a static that the machine spirit could not interpret. It is one thing to die for the Emperor, to have your name etched in a roll of honor, or even to be ground into the nameless dirt of 1,000,000,000,000 war zones. It is quite another to have the very fact of your birth, your struggles, and your contribution to the great work scrubbed from the tapestry of time by a force that leaves no ghost behind. My primary task was to witness the unwinding. I watched as the sector known as the Gilded Reach, a bastion of industry and faith, simply ceased to provide a signal. There was no transition, no final transmission of defiance, just a sudden, absolute void. The cogitator clicked, a dry, rhythmic sound like a death rattle, as it attempted to reconcile the missing data. I felt a cold sweat prickle my scalp beneath my hood. The protocol of unspoken absence dictates that should a certain threshold of these void events occur, the Inquisition must initiate a total informational blackout. We are to become a black hole of knowledge, pulling everything into the dark so that the enemy, whatever it may be, cannot use our own records to find its way to the heart of the Imperium. I remember the first time I heard of the protocol, whispered by a dying interrogator whose eyes had been boiled in his head by the things he had seen near the Eye of Terror. He spoke of a second shadow, a phenomenon that followed the Great Rift not as a wave of heat, but as a frost that froze the memory of the sun. He claimed that the Inquisition had discovered ancient Xenos texts that spoke of a weapon used in the Wars of the Gods, a device that didn't kill people, but unmade the concept of them. At the time, I dismissed it as the ramblings of a broken mind, a casualty of the warp's madness. But now, looking at the blinking runic prompts of the Tenebrae vault, I realized the madness was the only truth left. The machine spirit of the vault began to groan. The massive brass gears of the cooling fans, grinding against centuries of grit, as they labored to keep the processes from melting under the strain of the blackout sequence. I moved to the secondary gallery, my robes catching on the jagged edges of a discarded data slate. The gallery was lined with the skulls of former keepers, their eye sockets fitted with red lenses that stared back at me with a judgmental luminescence. They had overseen the recording of 1,000,000 purges, yet they had never seen the end of the record itself. The smell of burning insulation began to mask the incense. It was a sharp, chemical odor that spoke of systems being pushed beyond their mechanical limits. I thought of the billions of souls currently residing in the sectors being erased. Were they aware of their dissolution? Did they feel a momentary chill, a sense of vertigo as the reality around them lost its cohesion? Or did they simply blink and find themselves never having been? The horror of the Inquisition's burden is not the killing we do, but the knowing we endure. We are the ones who must stay awake while the rest of the galaxy dreams of a survival that is already a lie. I checked the chronometer on the wall. Its brass hands were spinning backward, caught in a temporal eddy caused by the sheer density of the data, erasure occurring nearby. Time was no longer a linear progression in the vault. It was a stagnant pool, turning brackish and foul. I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my chest, a pressure like an iron band being tightened. My own memories began to feel frayed at the edges. I tried to recall the name of the world where I was born, a hive world of iron and soot, but the image was flickering, losing its detail like a fading picked capture. This was the price of being the witness. To watch the protocol in action is to be touched by the void oneself. I turned away from the screen and began the manual bypass of the primary seals. The protocol demanded that I move to the lower sanctum, the place where the quiet engines were housed. These were not machines of metal and spark, but of flesh and psychic resonance. Unlucky psychers whose only purpose was to project a field of mental static so profound that it acted as a shroud for the vault. As I descended the spiraling staircase, the air grew colder, and the silence took on a vibratory quality. I could feel it in my teeth, a low-frequency hum that set my nerves on edge. The stairs were slick with a moisture that smelled of old blood and salt. Down here, the light was restricted to the dim, rhythmic pulsing of the life support canisters. Each pulse revealed a hallway lined with tubes, within which floated the pale, emaciated forms of the quiet ones. Their eyes were sewn shut, their mouths fused with vox grills that emitted a constant, low-level white noise. This was the Inquisition's ultimate shield, a choir of the damned singing a song of nothingness. I reached the control dais, a platform of black iron suspended over a pit of churning coolant fluid. The task before me was to synchronize the psychic output of the quiet ones with the incoming data void. It was a delicate, blasphemous balancing act. If I failed, the vacuum of the erased sectors would rush into the vault, consuming the Inquisition's most precious records and me along with them. If I succeeded, we would remain a hidden island in a sea of non-existence, waiting for a dawn that might never come. I placed my hands on the copper interface plates, and immediately my mind was flooded with the collective agony of the psychers. It wasn't a scream, but a hollow, echoing moan that stretched across the dimensions. I saw visions of cities turning to dust, of fleets vanishing in the mid-void, of mothers looking at their children and forgetting they had ever carried them. The protocol was working. It was eating the grief of the galaxy to fuel our invisibility. I felt a tear roll down my cheek, but it was cold, like a drop of melt water from a glacier. I was no longer a man. I was a component of a grand, terrifying machine. The shadows in the corner of the sanctum seemed to lengthen and take on a physical weight. I wasn't alone. In the peripheral of my vision, I saw the shimmer of a field cloak, an inquisitor of the Ordo Malleus, perhaps, or a guardian of the vault I had never met. They didn't speak. In this protocol, words were dangerous. Even a name spoken aloud could become a thread for the void to pull on. We stood in the darkness, two ghosts presiding over the funeral of a sector. The machinery around us began to glow with a sickly, violet light. The sign of warp conduit activation. We were drawing power directly from the Imperium to maintain the shroud. It was a gamble that would have seen us burned as heretics in any other circumstance. But here, at the end of all things, the only heresy was to be found. I watched as the readout on the days showed the Rajor percentage climbing 30%, 40%. The great Vox hymnal was now a distant memory, replaced by the wet slosh of the coolant and the rhythmic breathing of the quiet ones. I wondered if the High Lords of Terra knew. Did they sit in their golden spires, clutching their staves of office, and feel the foundation of their power becoming porous? Or were they already forgotten, their existence sustained only by the momentum of a bureaucracy that had outlived its purpose? The thought was a dangerous one, a seed of doubt that could bloom into madness. I pushed it down, focusing on the psychic harmonics. I had to remain the anchor. My identity, such as it was, Adept 7 and 34 Alpha, was the only thing holding the vault to the physical plane. I began to recite the litanies of the machine god. Not because I believed they would save me, but because the repetitive structure gave my mind something to cling to. The binary cant was a solid floor in a world of shifting sand. The void is coming. The pressure in the room suddenly shifted, my ears popping as the atmospheric regulators struggled with a sudden drop in pressure. A localized warp distortion was manifesting. On the far side of the sanctum, the air began to tear like wet parchment. I didn't move. To break the interface now would be to invite total annihilation. I watched as a hand, pale and translucent, reached through the tear. It wasn't the hand of a daemon, but something more clinical, more precise. It felt like the touch of a surgeon who had come to excise a tumor. Only the tumor was our reality. The Inquisitor in the shadows moved then, their hand going to a weapon I couldn't see. But they froze as the tear stabilized. A voice, or the memory of a voice, echoed in my mind. It said nothing, yet it conveyed a sense of profound, weary patience. It was waiting for us to finish. It was waiting for the protocol to complete its work, so that the erasure would be total. We are the ones who keep the Inquisition awake, because we are the ones who know that the Inquisition is not the shield. We are the janitors, cleaning up the mess of a dying universe, sweeping the dust of civilizations under the rug of the warp, so that the Emperor's dream doesn't have to face the nightmare of its own failure. The violet light intensified, casting long, distorted shadows against the weeping stone walls. I felt my connection to my own body beginning to slip. My legs felt distant, my hands like lead on the interface plates. I was becoming part of the archive, a living record of the disappearance. I looked at the quiet ones in their tubes, their sightless faces serene in their enforced oblivion. I envied them. They didn't have to watch the numbers. They didn't have to see the stars go out. They were the silence, and soon I would be too. The cogitator chime returned, but it was different now, a flat, electronic tone that signaled the completion of Phase 1. The blackout was total. To the rest of the galaxy, the Gilded Reach and its surrounding systems had never existed. The trade routes had already recalculated. The tithe sheets had been updated by auto, quills in 1,000 different offices, and the memories of the survivors were being actively suppressed by the shroud we had generated. It was a perfect crime against history. I pulled my hands from the plates, the skin tearing slightly where the copper had bonded with my flesh. I didn't feel the pain. I only felt the emptiness. The Inquisitor stepped forward out of the shadows, the light from the violet tear reflecting off a mask of polished silver. They looked at me, and for a moment, I saw a reflection of my own exhaustion in those cold, metallic eyes. "The protocol is sustained," the Inquisitor said, their voice a rasping whisper that sounded like dry leaves on a tombstone. "But the void is hungry, Adept. It will not be satisfied with one sector. It has found the scent of our fear." I nodded, my neck cracking with the effort. I had no words left. My role was to witness. And I had witnessed the death of 1,000,000 lives without a single drop of blood being spilled. That is the horror of the silent protocol. It is a war where no shots are fired, where no cries are heard, and where the only casualty is the truth itself. I looked back at the screen, where the static was now a smooth, grey expanse. There was nothing left to record. I picked up my data slate, the weight of it familiar and grounding, and began to walk back up the stairs. My vigil was not over. In the Inquisition, the vigil never ends. Even when there is nothing left to watch but the dark. The air in the upper levels was slightly warmer, but it carried the smell of ozone more strongly than before. I passed the rows of skulls again, and this time, I thought I saw them tilt their heads as I went by. The vault was changing. It was adapting to the new reality we had forced upon it. Every secret we bury adds a new layer of weight to the foundation, and I wondered how much longer the stone could hold. I reached my desk and sat down, the chair groaning under my slight frame. I picked up a quill, its tip dry and stained. I needed to write, not for the records but for myself. I needed to put down on parchment that I existed, that I saw the gilded reach, that I remembered the names of the stars before they were extinguished. But as I touched the quill to the paper, I found that I couldn't remember a single one. The protocol had worked too well. I was a scribe with nothing to write, a witness who had been blinded by the very thing he was meant to see. I sat there in the flickering light, a ghost in a tomb of his own making, while outside, the galaxy continued to spin, blissfully unaware that it was being eaten from the inside out by its own shadows. The hum of the machinery was my only companion now. It was a rhythmic, soothing sound that promised a final, permanent sleep. But I couldn't sleep. The protocol of unspoken absence wouldn't let me. It demanded that I stay awake, that I keep the lamps lit in the archive of the forgotten, until the very last light in the universe flickered and died. This is why we do not sleep, because we are afraid that if we close our eyes, even for a second, the rest of the world will vanish, and there will be no one left to notice that it's gone. I reached for the next ledger, a heavy, iron-bound volume that felt like a tombstone in my lap. I opened it to a blank page, the parchment smooth and cold. I would wait. I would wait for the next alarm, the next silence, the next erasure. I would be the one to turn the key and seal the door. It is a lonely, thankless task, but in the grim darkness of the far future, even the silence must be guarded. The transition from the first phase of the protocol to the second is not marked by a victory, but by a deepening of the rot in the foundation of my own psyche. I sat at my desk, the iron, bound ledger mocking me with its emptiness, while the taste of old pennies and stagnant water coated my tongue. The machinery of the Tenebrae vault continued its rhythmic, low-frequency thrum, a sound that I had begun to hear not with my ears, but with the very marrow of my spine. It felt as though the archives themselves were breathing, inhaling the history of the Imperium and exhaling a thick, suffocating fog of indifference. I looked at my hands, the skin translucent and mapped with blue veins like a chart of forgotten rivers, and I realized that the protocol of unspoken absence was not merely a defensive measure, it was a digestive process. We were breaking down the mass of the galaxy into something the golden throne could swallow, without choking on the magnitude of its own decay. The silence was no longer an absence of sound, but a physical presence that crowded the room, pushing against the stacks of data, slates and the jars of preserved biological samples that lined the walls. I stood up, my joints popping like dry twigs, and began the trek toward the cartographic sanctum. This was where the visual representation of our failure was projected, a holographic sphere of the galaxy that was currently being eaten by a spreading, grey malignancy. The air in the transition corridors was colder now, the heating elements having been diverted to the cooling fans of the psychic dampeners. My breath hitched in my throat, emerging as a pale ghost in the flickering light of the lumen strips. I passed an automated servo skull, its thrusters sputtering as it struggled to maintain altitude in the thickening atmosphere. It was carrying a scroll of red wax decrees, but it seemed to have forgotten its destination, circling a single bronze pillar in a repetitive, mindless loop. I felt a kinship with that machine. We were both performing rituals for a master who had perhaps already moved beyond the need for our service. Entering the cartographic sanctum, I was greeted by the sight of the Inquisitor I had seen below. He stood before the holographic globe, his silver mask reflecting the flickering light of a dozen different war zones. But he wasn't looking at the wars. He was staring at the blank spots, the holes in the map where the light of the Astronomicon should have been shining through. Those voids were expanding, not like a shadow moving across a surface, but like a stain rising through fabric. They represented sectors where the psychic resonance of humanity had simply been extinguished, leaving behind a silence so absolute that even the warp could not find purchase there. The Inquisitor did not turn as I approached. He remained as still as a statue in a graveyard, his heavy, fur-lined robes dusted with the white ash that was now falling from the ventilation grills. The smell here was different, less of ozone and more of ancient, undisturbed dust, the kind that gathers on the eyes of the dead. I looked at the projection and saw a cluster of stars near the vialed region begin to flicker. They didn't go supernova, they didn't collapse into black holes. They simply dimmed, their signatures softening until they were indistinguishable from the background radiation of the universe. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of vertigo. It was as if the floor beneath my feet had turned to liquid. I reached out to steady myself against a brass railing, the metal freezing cold against my palm. The Inquisitor finally spoke, his voice sounding like the grinding of tectonic plates. He told me that the protocol was accelerating because the hunger had changed its vector. It was no longer consuming space, it was consuming the continuity of the Imperial record itself. He explained that the Inquisition had discovered a terrifying truth during the investigation of the star, System 88 Beta. They had found worlds where the buildings still stood, where the machines were still running, and where the air was still breathable. But there was not a single soul to be found. More importantly, there was no evidence that there had ever been souls there. No graveyards, no records of birth, no discarded toys or half-finished meals. The worlds had been sanitized of their own history. It was as if a giant hand had reached down and erased the chalk, marks of an entire civilization. This was the threat that the protocol of unspoken absence was designed to hide. If the common citizenry of the Imperium knew that their very existence could be retracted without a trace, the resulting wave of nihilistic terror would feed the ruinous powers, more than 1,000 Black Crusades ever could. We are the guardians of the illusion of permanence. I watched as the Inquisitor reached into the holographic field, his gloved hand passing through a nebula as if it were nothing but smoke. He pointed to a tiny, isolated point of light on the edge of the Segmentum Pacificus. He told me that this world, a minor shrine, world of no strategic importance, was the next to go. He asked me if I remembered its name. I searched my mind, scanning the mental files I had spent centuries compiling, but I found only a blank wall of static. I had already forgotten it. The protocol was working ahead of the event, scrubbing my memory even as the world was being unmade. I felt a sense of profound, hollow grief, not for the people on that world, for I could no longer conceive of them, but for the loss of my own function. What is a scribe who cannot remember what he has scrubbed? The Inquisitor turned to me then, the red lenses of his mask glowing with a dull, predatory light. He said that the next phase required me to enter the black cells, the lowest level of the Tenebrae vault, where the Eaters of Names were kept. These were entities, some xenos, some warp-tainted, some of origin so ancient they defied classification, that possessed the ability to consume information. We used them as living incinerators for the data that was too dangerous to even be kept in the quiet engines. I felt a cold dread settle in my gut. The black cells were a place from which no one returned unchanged. The very air there was said to be composed of the screams of the forgotten. But I had no choice. I was a tool of the Ordo Scriptum, and a tool does not fear the forge. The descent to the black cells was a journey through the bowels of a dying god. The walls were no longer stone or metal, but a fused, obsidian-like substance that seemed to absorb the light of my flickering torch. The silence here was different. It was heavy, pressurized, like the weight of the ocean on a deep sea diver. I could hear the thumping of my own heart, a frantic, uneven beat that seemed far too loud in the stillness. The air was dry and tasted of ash and old parchment. I reached the gate of the black cells, a massive slab of lead and silver inscribed with the most potent wards the Grey Knights could provide. 2 mechanical sentries, their bodies more weapon than man, stood guard. They didn't move as I approached, their sensory arrays tracking me with a clicking, predatory precision. Inside the cells, the darkness was absolute. I felt my way along the wall, the smooth obsidian cold against my fingers. I could hear a soft, wet sound, like something large and blind moving through mud. This was the home of the Eaters. I reached the central console, a primitive thing of iron and crude glass, and began the sequence to feed the names of the erased systems to the entities in the dark. As the data, slates were inserted into the feeding slots, the sounds in the darkness grew louder. There was a sense of frantic, desperate hunger, a rustling of unseen limbs, and the snapping of jaws that shouldn't exist. I felt a wave of psychic feedback that nearly knocked me off my feet. It was a sensation of being pulled apart, of my thoughts being teased out of my brain like threads from a garment. I stayed at the console for what felt like hours, feeding the hunger of the abyss. Each name I gave up felt like a piece of my own soul being torn away. I saw flashes of faces, of landscapes, of the smell of rain on a dusty plain, and then they were gone, swallowed by the things in the dark. This is the true price of the silent protocol. To save the Imperium, we must become the very thing that destroys it. We must become the void. When the last slate had been consumed, the darkness fell silent once more. The entities were sated for now. I turned to leave, but my legs gave out, and I slumped against the cold obsidian wall. I closed my eyes, and for a moment, I saw the galaxy not as a collection of stars and worlds, but as a vast, empty graveyard, where the only monument was the silence we had created. The cold of the black cells does not lift when you ascend. It hitches a ride in your marrow, a hitchhiker made of frost and forgotten sins. As I climbed the 333 steps back to the upper archives, the physical sensation of the Tenebrae vault shifted. The rhythmic thrum of the machinery had changed pitch, moving from a low industrial growl to a frantic, high-pitched whine that set my teeth on edge. The air was no longer just thin, it was becoming brittle. In the flickering light of the corridor lumens, I saw the first signs of the protocol's third phase, the physical transmutation of the records themselves. I passed a row of data, crypts where the heavy iron doors were beginning to sweat a thick, black ichor. It wasn't oil, and it wasn't blood. It was the liquefied remains of data that had lost its conceptual anchor. When a world is erased by the silent protocol, the physical records of that world, the paper, the silicon, the hard stack memory, begin to reject their own existence. The ink slides off the page like melting wax, and the metal of the cogitators becomes porous and soft. I reached the scriptum logarium, a chamber of immense proportions where 10,000 quills were usually engaged in the tireless transcription of imperial tithers. Now, they were screaming. The sound was a mechanical cacophony of scratching metal as the quills moved with a violent, erratic energy, carving deep, nonsensical furrows into the parchment scrolls. They weren't writing words, they were scratching out the shape of the void. I walked through the rows of desks, the floor slick with the black ink, sludge that was overflowing from the wells. The servitors assigned to the chamber were malfunctioning, their organic components twitching in synchronization with the jagged movements of the quills. One servitor, its jaw replaced by a brass vox grill, turned its head 180 degrees to watch me pass. It wasn't a threat, it was a malfunction born of reality's thinning fabric. I felt the taste of iron in my mouth grow stronger, a sign that the local physics of the vault were being compromised by the sheer volume of non-existence we were processing. I reached the center of the logarium, where a massive, suspended hourglass filled with pulverized bone served as our primary temporal anchor. The bone dust was flowing upward. Gravity was becoming a suggestion rather than a law. I stood before the High Archivist's pulpit, an elevated platform of dark mahogany and brass that overlooked the chaos of the scratching quills. The Inquisitor was there again, his silver mask now stained with the black ichor of the dissolving records. He held a shard of obsidian in his hand, a fragment from the black cells, and he was using it to trace symbols in the air that glowed with a sickly, bruised purple light. He told me that the protocol had reached the point of echo. This is the moment when the universe notices the holes we have cut into it and tries to heal the wound by pulling the surrounding reality into the gap. We weren't just erasing sectors anymore. We were holding back a collapse. The smell in the logarium was unbearable, the scent of burning hair, wet stone, and the sharp, nose-bleeding sting of ozone. I looked up at the vaulted ceiling and saw the gargoyles shifting. Their stone eyes were following the Inquisitor's movements. He explained that the silent protocol was originally conceived by a splinter faction of the Ordo Originatus, men and women who believed that the only way to save the Imperium from the warp was to make the Imperium fundamentally unknowable. If the Chaos Gods feed on the emotions and histories of sentient beings, then a humanity with no history and no record of its own suffering becomes a barren feast. It is a scorched earth policy applied to the soul. But the cost was becoming apparent. By removing the weight of our history, we were becoming light enough to be blown away by the slightest warp squall. The Inquisitor handed me a data slate that felt impossibly heavy, as if it contained the mass of a star. He told me I had to take it to the solar reliquary, the heart of the vault where the most sacred, forbidden artifacts of the Inquisition were kept. On this slate was the master key of the protocol, the ultimate set of commands that would seal the erased sectors permanently, cutting them off from the warp and the material universe alike. But to do so, I would have to walk through the Hall of Ancestors, a place where the psychic imprints of every scribe who had ever served the Tenebrae Vault were preserved. In the current state of the protocol, those imprints would be screaming. I took the slate, my hands shaking so violently that I nearly dropped it. The Inquisitor didn't offer a word of encouragement. He only pointed toward the heavy, iron-bound doors at the far end of the hall. The journey through the Hall of Ancestors was a descent into a waking nightmare. The walls were lined with thousands of glass jars, each containing a preserved brain or a cluster of neural filaments. As I walked, the jars began to vibrate, and a low, mournful moaning filled the air. It wasn't a sound heard with the ears, but a vibration felt in the teeth and the temples. The memories of the dead were leaking out, triggered by the proximity of the Master Key. I saw flashes of the Great Crusade, of the Siege of Terror, of the long, slow rot of the millennia. But these weren't glorious visions. They were the discarded memories of the Inquisition, the secret shames, the necessary atrocities, the faces of the innocents burned to keep a greater secret. The protocol was drawing these memories in, using them as a fuel to power the final erasure. I felt a hand on my shoulder, cold and translucent, and I turned to see a figure in the robes of a 10th millennium scribe. He had no face, only a void where his features should have been. He tried to speak, but the only sound that came out was the scratching of an auto quill on parchment. I pushed forward, the master key glowing with a dull, red light that pulsed like a heartbeat. The floor beneath my feet felt like it was made of sponges, giving way with every step. The air was so thick with psychic static that I could see sparks dancing in the corners of my vision. I reached the solar reliquary, a chamber lined with lead and gold, where the temperature was so low that the very air seemed to have frozen into jagged crystals. In the center of the room sat a machine of ancient, forgotten design, the Loom of Silence. It was a complex web of silver wires and pulsing organic components, designed to weave the threads of reality into a protective shroud. I approached the interface, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The master key fit into the primary slot with a mechanical click that sounded like a gunshot in the frozen air. Immediately, the Loom of Silence began to spin. The silver wires moved with such speed that they became a blur of light. I felt a sudden, agonizing pull in my chest, as if my own life thread were being drawn into the machine. The visions returned, but this time they were focused on the present. I saw the gilded reach, the sector we had erased, and I saw what lay beyond the veil of our protocol. It wasn't a void. It was a churning, white-hot sea of nothingness that was clawing at the edges of the Imperium. The protocol wasn't just hiding the sectors, it was acting as a dam, holding back a flood of non-existence that threatened to wash away the entire galaxy. I realized then that the silent protocol was a misnomer. It wasn't silent because there was no sound. It was silent because the sound it made was so loud it obliterated the capacity to hear. I stood there, my hands gripped tightly on the control rails of the loom, as the reality of the vault began to dissolve around me. The walls of the reliquary faded, replaced by a view of the stars. But the stars were wrong. They were flickering out in a pattern that mirrored the beating of my own heart. I saw the Inquisitor standing in the distance, his silver mask a tiny point of light in the growing darkness. He was watching me, his arms crossed over his chest, a silent observer to the final act of my service. I felt a sense of profound, terminal peace. I was no longer Adept 734 Alpha. I was the thread. I was the silence. I was the sacrifice that kept the lie of the Imperium alive for one more day. The machine reached a crescendo, a sound like 1,000 worlds screaming at once, and then everything went black. When I regained consciousness, I was back in my small cell in the upper archives. The air was still and smelled of incense and old paper. The scratching of the auto quills had returned to its normal, rhythmic pace. I looked at my hands, and they were no longer stained with the black ichor. The iron-bound ledger sat on my desk, and for the first time in 3,000 years, it was full. I opened it, my heart pounding, but the pages were blank. Or rather, they weren't blank. They were filled with words I could see but couldn't read. The characters were shifting, changing every time I blinked. It was a record of things that hadn't happened, of people who hadn't existed, of a galaxy that was a shadow of itself. I realized then that the third phase of the protocol was the most terrifying of all, the replacement of truth with a more convenient silence. I sat at my desk and picked up my quill. I had a new task now. I was to be the architect of the new history. I would write the names of the worlds that had replaced the Gilded Reach. I would create the tithe, records for sectors that were nothing but ghosts. I would populate the galaxy with lies so perfect that even the Emperor wouldn't be able to tell the difference. This is the silent protocol that keeps the Inquisition awake at night. Not the fear of being destroyed, but the knowledge that we have already been unmade, and that we are the only ones left to pretend that we haven't. I began to write, the ink flowing smoothly onto the page. The first name I wrote was a world called Hope, even though I knew, with a certainty that burned like fire, that it was a place that had never been. The fourth movement of the protocol is not a deletion, but a reorganization of the fundamental laws governing the archive's relationship with reality. I awoke to a sensation of being submerged in thick, freezing, my lungs struggling to pull oxygen from an atmosphere that had become chemically heavy and thick with the scent of wet copper and ancient dust. The walls of my cell, once solid stone, now appeared to vibrate with a translucent quality, as if they were merely a projection of a memory that was rapidly losing its focus. I realized that the solar reliquary had not just reset the vault, it had detached it. We were no longer anchored to the same timeline as the Imperium. We were drifting in a pocket of manufactured stasis, a cyst of forgotten knowledge suspended in the gut of the warp. This is the stage known as the hollow congruence, the point where the Inquisition realizes that to hide the truth, they must become as ethereal as the lies they weave. I stepped out into the corridor, my feet making no sound on the floor. The silence was so dense it felt like a physical weight pressing against my eardrum, a sensory deprivation so absolute that my own thoughts began to sound like shouted commands. I encountered a group of red-robed tech priests of the Mechanicus, their mechanical augmentations whirring in a discordant symphony of clicks and groans. They were not maintaining the pipes or the cogitators, they were performing a ritual of orn-making, with plasma cutters and heavy iron hammers. They were systematically destroying any piece of equipment that had been touched by the data of the erased sectors. It was a purge of the inanimate. I watched as a massive logic engine, a machine that had calculated the tithers of 100 systems for 10 millennia, was reduced to a pile of molten slag and twisted wire. The priests did not speak, their binary cant had been replaced by a rhythmic, mechanical sobbing that echoed through the vents. The smell of the vault had shifted again, becoming sharp and antiseptic, like a surgical ward after a mass amputation. The air was filled with the fine, white dust of ground up record books, a snowstorm of lost history that coated my robes and filled my mouth with the taste of chalk. I made my way toward the sanctum of falsehoods, the chamber where the new reality was being forged. This was the final destination for the data slates I had processed. Here, a cadre of inquisitorial agents known as the Null scribes worked in total darkness, their eyes replaced by sensory arrays that allowed them to see the subtle vibration of a lie. Their task was to invent the substitute histories for the void zones, to create heroes who never fought, battles that were never won, and worlds that never turned. As I entered the sanctum, I felt a wave of nausea. The psychic pressure was immense, a cacophony of competing fictions clashing in the air. I saw one scribe hunched over a flickering terminal, his fingers moving with a blur of speed as he generated a fake lineage for a planetary governor of a world that was now nothing but a hole in the map. The fiction had to be perfect. It had to have the weight of tradition, the grime of history, and the complexity of real life. If a single detail was inconsistent, the warp would find the gap and tear the illusion apart. The Inquisitor with the silver mask was there, standing in the center of the room, his presence a dark anchor in the sea of shifting data. He turned to me, and for the first time, he removed his mask. Beneath it, there was nothing, no eyes, no nose, no mouth, only a smooth, featureless surface of pale skin that reflected the flickering light of the screens. He spoke directly into my mind, his voice a cold, sharp blade of thought. He told me that the protocol had reached its most dangerous phase because the echo was starting to answer back. The void we had created was not empty. It was being filled by something else, something that wore the shape of our forgotten memories, but lacked their soul. He called them the hollowed, entities of pure informational hunger that were born from the friction between the truth and the lie. They were starting to manifest in the lower levels of the vault, appearing as shadows of people who had been erased, seeking to reclaim the space they once occupied in the record. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. We weren't just hiding a secret, we were creating a ghost. The Inquisitor led me to a viewing port that looked down into the well of negation, a deep, cylindrical shaft where the physical remnants of the erased sectors were being dumped. I looked down and saw a swirling vortex of black liquid, within which floated the wreckage of ships, the crumbling spires of cathedrals, and the frozen bodies of soldiers, all of it turning to a fine, grey ash as it hit the surface of the pool. But as I watched, I saw a shape emerge from the liquid, a figure made of smoke and static that bore a terrifying resemblance to the High Archivist who had vanished during the first phase. It reached out a hand toward the glass of the viewing port, its face a distorted mask of grief and confusion. It didn't scream, it simply flickered, like a dying pict feed. The Inquisitor explained that my final task was to descend into the well and plant the anchor of oblivion. This device would collapse the pocket of reality we had created, pulling the vault and everything in it back into the main timeline of the Imperium, but with the holes permanently sealed by the weight of our collective amnesia. To do this, I would have to pass through the manifesting ghosts of the Hollowed. I took the anchor, a heavy, obsidian sphere that felt as cold as the heart of a dead sun, and began the descent. The air in the well was freezing, the temperature dropping so low that my sweat turned to needles of ice on my skin. The silence was replaced by a low, rhythmic thumping, like the beating of a giant, subterranean heart. As I reached the first gantry, the Hollowed began to emerge from the shadows. They didn't attack. They simply stood in my path, their translucent bodies flickering with the light of forgotten stars. I saw a young girl clutching a doll that was dissolving into ash. I saw an old man in the uniform of the Imperial Guard, his medals turning to lead. I saw a mother reaching out for a child who was already a ghost. They didn't speak, but I could feel their desperate need to be remembered. Every time I passed through one of them, I felt a piece of my own memory vanish. I forgot the face of my first mentor. I forgot the taste of the wine I had drunk to celebrate my promotion. I forgot the sound of the rain on the roof of the archive. I was becoming as hollow as they were. The further I descended, the more intense the cold became. The metal of the gantry was so brittle that it cracked under my weight. I reached the bottom of the shaft, where the black liquid of the well lapped against the stone. The surface was like a mirror, reflecting a sky that was empty of stars. I knelt at the edge and prepared to activate the anchor. But as I touched the surface of the sphere, the face of the Hollowed Archivist appeared in the liquid at my feet. He wasn't a ghost anymore, he was a reflection of me. He spoke, not with words, but with a feeling of profound, terminal exhaustion. He told me that the protocol was a cycle, every few millennia. The Inquisition erases the parts of itself that it can no longer bear to look at, and every time, a scribe is sent down to seal the grave. I wasn't the first, and I wouldn't be the last. I realized then that the silent protocol wasn't a defense against an external enemy. It was a defense against ourselves. It was how the Imperium survived its own failures, by simply forgetting they ever happened. The Gilded Reach hadn't been destroyed by a Xenos invasion or a warp rift. It had been destroyed by an administrative error, a clerical mistake that had led to the starvation of billions. The Inquisition couldn't admit to such a failure, so they had chosen to erase the entire sector rather than face the truth. The void was just our own shame made manifest. I looked at the anchor in my hands and felt a sudden, violent urge to throw it into the liquid and jump in after it. To be forgotten seemed like a mercy compared to the burden of remembering a lie. But the programming of 3,000 years was too strong. I am a tool of the Ordo Scriptum, and a tool does not choose its purpose. I activated the anchor. A wave of white light erupted from the sphere, moving with a speed that defied physics. It hit the black liquid and turned it to solid crystal in an instant. The ghosts of the Hollowed vanished, replaced by a searing, blinding void. I felt my body being pulled apart. My atoms stretched across the dimensions as the vault anchored itself to reality. The pain was beyond anything I had ever experienced, a sensation of being unmade and remade 1,000 times a second. When the light faded, I was back in the Scriptum Logarium. The Inquisitor was gone, The auto quills were silent. The air was warm and smelled of old parchment and dust. I looked at the desks and saw that they were clean, the black ink, sludge gone as if it had never been. I walked toward the window and looked out at the hive, city beyond the vault. The sky was filled with the usual smog and the silhouettes of Gothic spires, and the stars, those that could be seen through the haze, were shining with a steady, uncaring light. I checked the stellar maps, and the gilded reach was there, populated by worlds with names like Aethelgard and Arrests. The records were perfect. The tithers were up to date. The history was seamless. I sat at my desk and opened my ledger. My hands were steady now, the blue veins no longer visible beneath my skin. I picked up my quill and began to write the daily log. I recorded the temperature, the humidity, and the status of the cooling fans. I wrote nothing about the protocol, the Hollowed, or the Inquisitor with the silver mask. Those memories were already starting to fade, drifting away like smoke in a high wind. This is the final victory of the silent protocol. Even the ones who perform it eventually forget why it was necessary. I am a scribe of the Imperium, and my duty is to the truth, even if that truth is a lie that we all agree to believe in. I looked at the last line I had written, and for a moment, I couldn't remember writing it. I blinked, and the words seemed to shift on the page, settling into a pattern that was familiar and safe. The galaxy was at peace, and the Inquisition was awake, watching over a history that was as clean and empty as a fresh sheet of parchment. The final movement of the protocol of unspoken absence is not a conclusion, but a permanent, looping state of recursive denial. I sat in the restored quiet of my cell, watching the slow, rhythmic movement of a single dust mote as it drifted through a beam of pale, artificial light. The Tenebrae vault had returned to its equilibrium, its stone walls solid, and its brass fittings polished to a dull, respectable shine, yet I could feel the instability pulsing beneath the surface like a heartbeat in a cadaver. My hands, once stained with the ink of erased civilizations, were now impeccably clean, the skin smelling of the harsh lye and sanctified oils used by the reclamation servitors. I reached for a fresh data slate, its surface a pristine, unblemished gray, and I realized with a sudden, jarring clarity that the silence was no longer something outside of me. It had moved into the spaces between my thoughts, a quiet predator that had finally claimed its territory. The air in the archives was now perfectly regulated, a steady 20 degrees Celsius with exactly 40% humidity, yet I felt a persistent, bone, deep chill that no amount of thermal weave robes could dissipate. This was the fifth phase, the echo of the voided self. It is the stage where the witness becomes the final casualty of the record. To maintain the lie of the Imperium's continuity, the architect of the lie must eventually be dismantled. I stood up, my movements fluid and mechanical, and began my final walk through the corridors I had walked for 3 millennia. The gargoyles on the ceiling were once again frozen in their grotesque poses, their stone eyes no longer tracking my movement. The sense of being watched had vanished, replaced by the even more terrifying sensation of being completely ignored by the universe. I was a ghost in a machine that had already forgotten my serial number. I passed the great vox, Hymnal's primary speakers, and they were once again chanting the rhythmic litanies of the Emperor's divinity. The sound was comforting, a warm blanket of sound that covered the jagged edges of my memory. But if I listened closely, beneath the chanting and the low, frequency hum of the power conduits, I could still hear the scratching of the auto, quills from the 4th phase. It was a phantom sound, a psychic scar on the environment that refused to heal. I reached the doors of the High Archivist's inner sanctum, a place I had not entered since the beginning of the protocol. The heavy oak panels were etched with the history of the Ordo Scriptum, a glorious narrative of preserved knowledge and unwavering loyalty. I touched the carving of a scholar holding a torch, and the wood felt hollow, as if the history it depicted was merely a thin veneer over a rotting core. Inside the sanctum, the light was dim, provided by a single, massive candle made of the rendered fat of 100 martyrs. In the center of the room sat a throne of iron and bone, and upon it sat the Inquisitor. He had replaced his silver mask, the featureless expanse of his true face, hidden once more behind a facade of cold, metallic perfection. He was reading a ledger, his gauntleted finger tracing lines of text that I knew did not exist. He didn't look up as I entered. He told me, his voice a dry rasp that seemed to come from the walls themselves, that the protocol was a success. The Gilded Reach was gone, replaced in the minds of the High Lords and the records of the Administratum by a cluster of prosperous, boring mining worlds that had always been there. The Tither ships were already in transit, their holds filled with ore from worlds that had been birthed in a cogitator bank only hours before. The Inquisitor stood up, his heavy robes trailing on the floor like the wings of a fallen bird. He walked to a window that overlooked the inner workings of the vault, the massive gears and pistons that kept our pocket of reality stable. He explained that the silent protocol was the only thing keeping the Imperium from collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. Every day, the Emperor's domain suffers 1,000 small deaths, planets lost to neglect, armies vanished in the warp, entire sub-sectors consumed by bureaucratic incompetence. If the Imperium were to remember every failure, every lost soul, and every broken promise, the collective grief would create a new eye of terror in the heart of the segmentum solar. We are the surgeons who cut away the gangrene of memory so the body can pretend it is still whole. He turned to me then, the red lenses of his mask glowing with a final, terminal intensity. He told me that my vigil was over. The protocol of unspoken absence required one last deletion to be truly complete, the deletion of the scribe who had initiated it. I felt no fear, only a profound sense of relief. The burden of remembering the truth in a galaxy built on lies was a weight I was no longer capable of carrying. I had seen the holes in the stars, and I had felt the cold breath of the void, and I knew that there was no place for me in the sanitized history I had helped to create. I was the last piece of evidence, a living record of a crime against reality, and the sentence was the only thing that made sense. He led me to a small, circular chamber at the very heart of the sanctum, the final redaction. It was a room of white marble, lit by a soft, diffused light that seemed to come from nowhere. In the center was a simple stone plinth, with a single glass vial containing a drop of clear, shimmering liquid. The Inquisitor told me that this was the water of Leth, a distilled essence of the void we had harnessed. One drop would not kill the body, but it would dissolve the ego, erasing every memory, every thought, and every spark of identity, until I was nothing but a hollow vessel. I would be repurposed as a mindless drone, a servitor of the archives whose only task was to polish the brass and sweep the dust. Forever unaware of the secrets I had once guarded, I looked at the vial, and for a moment, I remembered the name of my home world. I remembered the smell of the sulfur, swamps, and the sound of the great iron bells tolling for the evening shift. I remembered the face of a woman who had smiled at me before I was taken by the black ships, her eyes the color of a stormy sea. These were the things I was being asked to trade for the survival of a lie. And in that moment, I realized that the Inquisition wasn't keeping the Imperium alive, it was keeping it in a state of permanent, agonizing undeath. We were the ones who ensured that the nightmare never ended, by ensuring that it could never be learned from. We were the guardians of a status quo that demanded the sacrifice of everything that made us human. I reached for the vial, my fingers trembling. The Inquisitor watched me, his silver mask a mirror that showed me a distorted version of myself, a withered, ink-stained ghost who had spent 3,000 years serving a shadow. I thought of the billions of souls in the Gilded Reach who had been unmade, and I realized that by joining them in oblivion, I was finally finding the only true company I had ever known. I uncorked the vial, the scent of nothingness rising from it like a cold vapor. I looked at the Inquisitor one last time and asked him if he ever wondered who would redact him when his time came. He didn't answer. Perhaps he had already been redacted 100 times over. I drank the liquid. It tasted of nothing. It was the absence of flavor, the absence of sensation, a coldness that started in my throat and spread through my chest like an ink stain on parchment. I felt my memories beginning to detach, drifting away like leaves in a storm. The face of the woman vanished. The smell of the sulfur swamps faded. The tolling of the iron bells fell silent. I saw the Inquisitor's mask begin to blur, the silver light turning into a grey haze. The room of white marble dissolved into a featureless void. I tried to remember my name, but the word was a slippery fish that eluded my grasp. I was adept, I was scribe, I was nothing. The transition was painless. It was a soft closing of a door, a gentle extinguishing of a candle. I felt my body being picked up by unseen hands, the weight of my robes falling away. I was being placed in a new container, a new shell for a new purpose. The memories were gone, replaced by a simple, rhythmic command that pulsed in the back of my mind: clean, preserve, obey. I opened my eyes, and the world was bright and sharp and completely unfamiliar. I was standing in a long corridor of stone and brass, holding a polishing cloth in my mechanical hand. I looked at the brass railing and saw a small smudge of tarnish. I began to rub, the movement rhythmic and soothing. I am a servitor of the Tenebrae Vault. I do not know how long I have been here, and I do not know the names of the men who pass me in the halls. Sometimes I see a man in a silver mask, and I feel a faint, flickering sensation in my chest, like a ghost of a heartbeat, but it passes quickly. I have no dreams, and I have no regrets. I am the perfect servant of the Imperium, for I have no history to compare to the present, and no hope to compare to the future. I am the silence that follows the protocol, the living proof that the Inquisition's greatest weapon is not the bolter or the blade, but the simple, absolute power to forget. High above, in the spires of the vault, the auto-quills continue their work, scratching out the story of a galaxy that never was. The stars continue to burn, and the wars continue to rage, and the secrets continue to pile up like snow in a graveyard. And somewhere in the deepest, most redacted level of the archives, there is a ledger with a single, blank page, waiting for the next scribe to realize that the lights are going out. This is the truth that keeps the Inquisition awake at night. The knowledge that they are the only ones left who remember that there was once something worth staying awake for. But for me, the night is over. I have found the peace of the void, and it is a silence that will never be broken.